All right, so last time we ended with the rise of Hitler's power, and what we're going to do today is talk about World War II in general. When we talk about a timeline of World War II, we have to remember that Adolf Hitler was indeed the aggressor of World War II. Uh, what he did was he aggressively attacked particular regions of Western Europe that would have been profitable or useful for the purpose of his growing empire for the Rhineland. So he occupies Poland in August of 1939. In April of 1940, he also occupies Norway and Denmark. Those two nations quickly fall. Something to keep in mind is that there is a shared religious background. The Scandinavian countries typically have a Lutheran state church for their nation states during this time period. In June of 1940, he attacks and he takes Paris, and so all of France falls to the Third Reich. Uh, if you are considering the purpose of all of this is to expand his power, and not only is he expanding his power, but he's also limiting the possibilities of Britain being able to assert themselves and get involved in some sort of way in order to protect its allies. In fact, Hitler is intentionally surrounding Britain, which sets everything up for the Battle of Britain, which happens in August of 1940. With the Battle of Britain, you have over and over again air assaults by the Luftwaffe, dropping bombs upon the British. One of the things that's really important to recall about these different things that are taking place is that as Hitler is stepping into particular spaces, he is purifying and also putting down any people that are going to dissent from his rule or from the authority of Germany. And so right here is a picture of the occupation of Poland in August of 1939. This is just before all of these clergymen who are part of the Catholic Church of Poland are about to be executed. With the occupation of Norway and with the occupation of Poland, you have the royal military of the British, and you have French resistance who are both trapped. And at the Battle of Dunkirk, you have the mass evacuation of almost three-fourths of the standing military in England. If this successful evacuation did not occur on the beaches of Dunkirk, this would have crippled and would have basically ended the war in Western Europe. Britain would have been taken. However, the combined naval assistance of the British Royal Navy and civilian naval boats in the English Channel were able to rescue all of these soldiers in April of 1940 so that Britain could continue on in the fight. Obviously, the Battle of Britain takes place in August through October of 1940, and the occupation of North Africa is the next wing of the offensive for the Germans. And so from 1940 through 1941, you see General Rommel and his troops with their tank cavalry taking the northern African desert terrain. There is resistance on the Eastern Front from Moscow, and so in December of 1941, Moscow is starting to push back the Eastern Front further westward towards Germany. And in the meanwhile, there really isn't a Western Front that exists. There is isolated Britain that is trying to survive on its lone British Isles. During this time, the Americans are supplying the British through 1940 and 1941, and any resistance troops that exist in France. But Pearl Harbor and the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese draws America immediately into the greater war with both Japan and its ally Germany, which Hitler declares war upon America immediately after the attack of Pearl Harbor, and so it was just an inevitability for the Americans to get involved. So here's a timeline of World War II from 1942 to 1945. You have the Americans fighting the war on two fronts. There is the Pacific, and then there is the European front or theater of war. The Pacific theater of war is very much a naval war that's taking place, that is basically won by the naval forces of the American Pacific Navy underneath the command of General MacArthur. At the Battle of Midway, the American troops are surprisingly successful and are able to gain this very important island as a landing place and a place for assaulting other Pacific islands. Battle of Midway Midway Island becomes a very strategic Air Force base for the Pacific theater of the war. And then in August of 1943 begins the Allied offensive. Originally, the British had wanted the Allies to invade Europe, but the Allied strategy for the Americans was to first gain control of Africa and enter into Europe through Italy. And so, beginning in August of 1943 through May of 1944, they start pushing across Africa very successfully underneath the command of General Eisenhower. So much so that by July and September of 1943, they have landed on Sicily, Italy, and they are starting to work their way north up through the Italian front. Once this theater and the eastern front of the Russians continues to push back the Germans are now spread so thin and are fighting on three different fronts. On two different fronts at this point. A third front is ripe to open up in the European theater. And so on June 6, 1944, you have the major assault on D-Day. This assault happened on a number of stretches of beaches along the Norman coast of France. It was a very heavy assault because the Germans had had plenty of time to reinforce themselves in bunkers and with really strong machine gun defenses. And so this was a very difficult assault, and a lot of American lives and other Allied troops' lives were lost in this attack. But the beaches of Normandy were taken, and it became a pretty advanced pushback across France. By August 24th, 1944, Paris becomes liberated. But that was not the end of the defenses. The Battle of the Bulge ended up being the major counteroffensive that the Germans put forward in December of 1944. In the Battle of Bulge, the American troops were basically surrounded at the city of Bastogne, and they were completely cut off for the winter months. The Germans demanded for Eisenhower to surrender, and Eisenhower replied that that was nuts, that they were going to continue to supply their troops. They were able to continue to do airdrops and supply their troops, and the American troops who were trapped in Bastogne ended up being relieved and supported and were able to finally push back the German counteroffensive. In August of 1945, you have the dropping of the A bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These two A bomb drops effectively ended the Pacific theater of the war. We haven't said very much about the Pacific theater of the war, but in the Pacific theater, there was a fairly rapid advance in the war for the Pacific theater, and they moved island by island quite successfully over the course of the next couple years after Pearl Harbor. And as they finally reached within striking distance and were able to have assaults upon the Pacific theater, upon the Japanese mainland, it became even more definitive that the Japanese were ultimately going to have to surrender. In the next lecture, we'll continue to talk more about the Pacific theater and the Holocaust.